Welcome everybody to Lala Celebrates Kerouac. Mike Flynn, president of Lala Celebrates Kerouac. I'm very excited for our next event. This is one of our mainstays of our festival. We call it Talking Jack, and this year it's going to be led by Erik Mortenson, who's the author of this phenomenal book, which there are copies of here in the store that you can get. It's a collection of essays, and all of these other gentlemen are contributors to it. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to our moderator for this Talking Jack, Mr. Erik Mortenson.
Thank you, Mike. So, just a quick preamble. I want to thank Mike again for including us, and Laura here at Lala Books for hosting us. It's always great to see a local bookstore. Thank you to the audience for showing up, and of course our speakers. So basically we have four of the contributors to this volume here to talk a little bit about their work. Brett Sigurdson, right, from Alexandria College, whose work I'm very interested in, and gave a great talk last night. He's here. Hassan Melehy, University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He's a contributor as well. You probably know his work. My back of my book promotes his book, so Bloomsbury's all working together. And he's obviously been a huge factor in the turn towards looking at Kerouac's sort of French influence and heritage, and how that plays into how we think about Jack Kerouac. So we welcome him. Kurt Hemmer, you might know from the conferences or past conferences, an old friend of mine. We played the game last night at the bar of trying to think how long we've known each other, and then stop, because that would only make us feel bad about how old we are. So, but Kurt's work, he covers all the beats, Jack Kerouac especially, and he's, in addition to his scholarly work, he also does a lot of film work, and he's just a great guy to talk to about the beats. So, welcome him. And then last but certainly not least, Michael Milner, who I have the pleasure of meeting. I tried to meet at the event last night, but he was a bit too quick for me and got out of the building. But I'm, finally happy to see him, associate professor at UMass Lowell and director of the Kerouac Center. And yeah, you probably know him better than I do, those of you around Lowell. So I'll leave it at that. But very interesting work in relationship to the archive. And unfortunately, Ronna Johnson was supposed to be here, but is sick, so we wish her well. Hopefully she'll have a speedy recovery. So just quickly, books for sale. This book, as the title suggests, Rethinking Kerouac, is just a chance to try to think more about the complicated figure that is Jack Kerouac. It takes Kerouac's work into consideration, Kerouac the writer, but also Kerouac the cultural icon, looking at his work both in the US context, but also internationally. As maybe you probably know, Kerouac isn't just an American phenomenon at this point, right? He's sort of traveled physically himself, has traveled, written about other places, but also has been picked up in translation and cultural appropriation throughout the globe. So the book touches on that as well. Divided into three parts. One is the work itself, and by work, I mean not just the writing certainly, but also the poetry. There's a chapter on his painting. Brett will talk about his screenwriting. Steve Bledsoe, who was here last year, talks about his nonfiction prose. Right, so we're kind of rethinking Kerouac in a broader way. So if you're interested in any of that, please pick up the book. There's some very interesting chapters on what Kerouac is doing in his writing, but also outside of his writing as well. Book looks at Kerouac.
I found little snippets of film, treatments, or little bits of dialogue in his notebooks that I surmise he intended for, part of a larger project that could entail a film or even a theater script. And so I just kind of collected all my thoughts and materials about Kerouac's attempts at his screenwriting, and just tried to kind of plot them in time and try to kind of figure out what were these projects and what did they lead up to, if anything. And what I actually found was it wasn't actually the projects, the film treatments or screenwriting attempts that he made that were interesting, though they were a bit, maybe formulaic, a bit trite. What I actually found was that was more important or more interesting was that he seemed to use screenwriting as a genre, as a way to work out ideas, right, and work out different ways to tell a story. If you were at my talk at the talk yesterday, in my portion, I talked about Kerouac making that kind of fake newspaper, American Times, as a way to, maybe try to visualize the story he was trying to tell about, French Canadian immigrants in Little Canada here in Lowell. And I kind of started to think about his screenwriting attempts as a similar kind of creative device, where it allowed him to maybe get a different dimensional look at creative projects. And that would maybe inspire new ideas, new directions in whatever pieces he was trying to work on. So that's kind of the ultimate takeaway of my piece. So in it, I talk a lot about, again, some of the projects that were attempted, cast off. One of them is, I think, is the most interesting, is treatment of Dr. Sachs. He did a full screenplay of Dr. Sachs. Granted, it was missing like a lot of, camera directions and a lot of other kinds of, things we see in screenplays. But it was his attempt to try to look at Dr. Sachs in a different way, in a film-centered way, and I found that really compelling. I think he was trying to, when he wrote the Dr. Sachs screenplay, he was trying to make some money, frankly, but also there was this idea of trying to recapture that story in a different way, through a different lens, that I thought was really compelling. So bottom line, there's so much work still to be done on Kerouac in film, I think. There's much more to discover. For instance, there's a whole screenplay of On the Road from the 1957-58, down at the New York Public Library. I've been itching to get my hands on, to see, how Hollywood kind of originally conceived of On the Road. What I know of it, and talk a little bit about it in here, is much different than On the Road, the story, right? The novel. In fact, Dean Moriarty, that character, is meant to die in a fiery crash at the end. This great, this kind of, morality play, right? Where the lascivious, like Dean, dies for his sins. That's one part that I know it was discussed in the original screen treatment. So at any rate, again, an example of more work that could be done in Kerouac in film and screenwriting. So, yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions as we go along.
Yeah, the whole question at the end, but that's good. Okay, Kurt.
My chapter is called Recovering Jack Kerouac's Blackface Novel Pick. So I would just like to read a little bit of it so you get a taste of what I'm talking about. 12 years after finding himself in the New York Times bestsellers list with his second and most famous novel, On the Road, Kerouac was in financial dire straits. Living in St. Petersburg, Florida with his third wife, Stella, and his ailing mother, Gabrielle. On October 12, 1969, he wrote to his agent, Sterling Lord, while sending him the conclusion to his latest novel, Pick. Quote, "For God's sakes, man, I've got to live too. That is, pay the rent," unquote. With his once prolific writing talent waning and a desperate need for money, he had given up his attempt to write a novel covering the last decade of his life, tentatively titled Beat Spotlight, and turned to a work he had discarded before writing what would become On the Road. Pick was not a work informed by his experiences after writing On the Road, but a return to the racial conceptions Kerouac had formulated before his fame. Kerouac conceived of Pick while living with his mother, his sister, and her family in Rocky Mount, North Carolina, in the summer of 1951. Pick, set in 1948, is a story narrated by a 10-year-old black child, Victoria Review Jackson, to his grandfather, which is, I think, an aspect of it a lot of people don't realize. Pick's talking to his grandfather in that novel. The narrator is rescued by his brother John, known as Slim, a struggling jazz musician, from being sent to a foster home. The novel depicts their travels from North Carolina to New York City and then to San Francisco to start a new life. Tim Hunt argues that Pick can be seen as Kerouac's third version of his road novel, what was published as On the Road in 1957, being the fourth version of 5 different versions Hunt identifies. With the public opening of the Kerouac papers at the Burke Collection in New York Public Library, Hassan Melehy has identified several more versions of Kerouac's road novel, written in French.
I didn't identify them, by the way. And I read that in your piece. I appreciate the shout out, but those Kerouac himself said that Sur le Chemin was a way of. He said it in a letter to Neil Cassidy. I didn't think of that. I mean, so but thank you. Yeah.
There are other versions of the road novel written in French.
Yeah.
We're not going to recall the book at this point. This is going to
Yeah.
say. It's going to say.
Barry Gifford and Lawrence Lee point out that the original ending of Pick had the child narrator meet up with Sal Paradise and Dean Moriarty, the protagonists of On the Road, but that Kerouac's mother, an extremely religious Catholic, did not like the ending and helped her son come up with the published ending, having a Catholic priest help Pick and his brother get off the road. Sal and Dean make a cameo in Pick, and I don't think a lot of people realize this. Pick actually works within the Douglas legend, as the 2 men in a speeding car dressed in, quote, blue choo-choo master suits, unquote, headed west, who pick up Pick and Slim and drop them off in Pittsburgh. The novel was dedicated to Dr. Danny DeSole, a psychiatrist who had prescribed the Dexedrine Kerouac depended on to help him complete his final work. Surprisingly, considering that Kerouac's novels were notorious for generating unflattering reviews, Pick received a few favorable reviews when it was published posthumously in 1971, seemingly in deference for the deceased. Playboy said that the short novel, quote, more than any other book he wrote, gives us a convincing picture of perfect, freewheeling, life-loving bliss. The talk that pours out of Pick's breathless mouth is real, fantastic, fanciful, and utterly enchanting. This is the best review we ever done. It creates a world that, like many of us, hassled as we are by racial and generational conflict, dreamily nostalgic for the good old days when kids like Pick still could exist. A lovely book. Of course, there was never a time when a kid like Pick could exist. And in retrospect, this praise of the book is dumbfounding. Yet it was echoed in the Rolling Stone review by Don Paul, calling the book, quote, pleasurable and, quote, nice, and adding, quote, its goodness and excitement come from Pick Kerouac's vigorous evocation of American parts and bits of American life with words that vivify everything. Magic language, words the reader hears. Conflating Kerouac's voice with Pick suggests that Paul saw the novel as Kerouac speaking to his readers through the child, just as Kerouac had spoken through his narrators in all his novels since On the Road. Thus, Pick can be read as Kerouac in blackface. It is a retelling of the first road experiences with an intensified naivete, something he purposefully used to capture an emotional engagement with the world he wanted to convey to his readers. Gerald Nicosia writes, quote, almost every incident in Pick comments on something that happened to Jack and does so from the fresh perspective of viewing himself as a member of another race. That Kerouac should cast himself as a black boy is not so surprising, considering the Canucks were les nègres blancs, unquote. The parallel scenes between On the Road and Pick help us discern Kerouac's attitude about race. And what I do is I go through Pick and I look at the parallel scenes from On the Road involving Sal and all the parallels, and there are several really important ones, with Pick and tried to show how there's different reactions between the white character Sal and the black character Pick that show us Kerouac's understanding of blackness. And I'll just end with one final paragraph here before we move on. For Kerouac, Kerouac saw blacks as part of the Fellaheen, the people of the earth. Fellaheen is a term Kerouac took from Oswald Spengler's 2-volume, The Decline of the West. Hassan, you do write about this very well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll say, after you're done, I'll say what I did say about Kerouac's two novellas in French, but thank you. I'm going to say a little bit about Spengler, too.
Okay.
So,
And purposely misappropriated. Spengler did not see the Fellaheen from Kerouac's romantic perspective. The German historian saw the Fellaheen as humanity's basest form, surviving the death of each great culture as civilizations collapsed upon themselves. Spengler writes, quote, "At the last, only the primitive blood remains, alive, but robbed of its strongest and most promising elements. This residue is the Fella type," unquote. Kerouac changed Fellaheen to mean the authentic people of the world whose purity was superior to the corrupted, industrialized, first world, quote-unquote, civilized people, destined to be destroyed by their own mechanization. From Spengler's perspective, quote, "Life as experienced by primitive and by Fellaheen peoples is just the zoological up and down, a planless happening, without goal or cadenced march in time, wherein occurrences are many, but in the last analysis, devoid of significance," unquote. In conscious transfiguration of Spengler's use of Fellaheen, Kerouac writes in On the Road that Fellaheen are, quote, "the essential strain of the basic primitive wailing humanity that stretches in a belt around the equatorial belly of the world. They were not fools, they were not clowns, they were great. They were the source of mankind and the fathers of it." Throughout Kerouac's oeuvre, references to the Fellaheen appear, making it one of the foundational motifs of his writing.
Yeah.
We can clap. I mean, that's a great segue.
okay, all right. Well, thank you. Okay, okay, what do I want to say? Well, I am giving the keynote address tomorrow, so I'm not going to, I can give a preview of that. And just to, so I'll start with, I'll give a preview of that. I'm not actually going to talk about Kerouac. I'm going to talk a little bit about his French-Canadian background. What I did in my book in 2016, it came out in 2016. I've got some copies here, and if anyone wants to, I bought them. Basically, I bought them at my author's discount, and I will sell them at cost, which is $30. That's as low as I could get a scholarly book to go. So I have a few copies, and if I run out, which I probably won't, I have some discount coupons from. I did get Bloomsbury to give me a pretty good discount coupon for these. But I have a total of 10 to sell at my own cost for that. And but yeah, what I wrote about there, it was my starting point was Kerouac's French-Canadian background, the fact that he was a native French speaker, and that he was part of the massive migration from Quebec that happened basically between the mid-19th century and the early 20th century, and about 1930, when immigration was basically shut down after the Wall Street crash and the Great Depression started. And curiously enough, and I'm just going to telescope this a little bit because I'm going to say more about this tomorrow. There's a preview, as I said. There were virtually no restrictions on immigration in the 19th century, except until 1875, when the Chinese, there were restrictions against the Chinese, and the Chinese, and the motivation for that was because people thought the Chinese were stealing American jobs. They were willing to work for cheap and long hours, and that's actually also why the French Canadians were called by the otherwise very progressive Carol Wright. I'm sorry, this title. This is my paper tomorrow. The Secretary of the Massachusetts Secretary of Labor Statistics, later U.S. Secretary of Labor, he was actually the first Secretary of Labor, Carol Wright, the Chinese of the Eastern States, because he was in favor of the 40-hour week and minimum wage, which did not exist at the time, and he thought the French Canadians were undermining it. To his credit, when the community in Massachusetts went to the legislature and said, that wasn't very nice of him to say, they gave a long, spokespeople gave a very long explanation, and he apologized. He apologized. He said, "I'm sorry, I got this wrong." Okay, anyway, I'll say a bit about that tomorrow. But yeah, so I was just fascinated with the way, when I first started reading Kerouac, and I was always, I don't know, French was my second language. I learned it in school. I studied it in college. I was fascinated with French stuff. But you know, I'd also grown up in New England, an hour and a half south from here. And I grew up around a lot of French speakers. And one of the first things I noticed when I started taking French in high school is that everything about their French was different from what I was learning in school. Because despite the fact that the reason French had legs in Connecticut, in northeastern Connecticut, was there were a lot of heritage speakers. But we were taught the French that came from Paris instead, the official version of French. And so I did notice fairly early on that what Kerouac was writing was not the French I had learned. I mean, I could read it, it was readable, but he was spelling partly phonetically. There was partly, he always said it was phonetically, but there was a little bit more to it than that. He liked the fact that Québécois French, and this is kind of a myth in Quebec, that they're actually speaking pre-revolutionary French, which they're not, but that's a myth for various reasons. And he liked that idea, so he sometimes used these archaisms, which do turn up in Québécois French, but then he would use archaic spellings, which actually aren't phonetic. Like, he would include an S in the word ancêtre, for ancestor, which is not pronounced in Québécois, not pronounced in France. It was pronounced in the 16th century, and Kerouac would include it as an archaic spelling. You know, it's just. So I was just fascinated with, and he would use some of the French in the novels, and sometimes make multilingual puns. I thought this is really super interesting. And I did think also that sometimes his English sentences seemed to be written as though they were in a foreign language with word-for-word translation. And when he would have parallel passages, one next to the other, I'm going to get to Rethinking Kerouac pretty soon. Well, one next to the other, he would often do these word-for-word translations. The way you're taught not to translate. You know, you don't just take the sentence and add one word at a time. Okay, but he did that to show what happens when languages collide with each other. What happens when people speaking different languages mix together. And yeah, so I was really interested in this idea of how he conceived of America as a multilingual place, as a place, multilingual and I don't want to say multicultural, it's such a buzzword now, but before many of us were thinking in those terms, Kerouac was thinking, what happens when people with so many different presuppositions about themselves, the world, religion, human interaction get together? What happens then? And so this became his fascination with the road, I think. And the road is an important figure, actually, an important idea in Quebec in the 19th century because of the migration. His fascination with the road stems from his fascination with this going on the road to migrate. And he meets migrants all across the country. He meets migrant farm workers in California. He meets Okies in the lower Midwest. He's fascinated with African Americans because of the migrancy. I mean, so he does use that word felahin. And when I first encountered that, I remember I grew up. I have an Arabic name, but I don't speak it. My father spoke Arabic, so I did know a few words. I did recognize felahin when I saw it first on the road as an Arabic word. And I remember once my father, who actually grew up in a very bourgeois Egyptian family, joking with an Egyptian student of his, and they were saying, and I can't actually pronounce it correctly, but felahin. And I knew what they were saying. They were kind of joking about peasants, and I think they were being a little bit mean about bad peasant habits. So what is this? Why is Kerouac using the word felahin, peasantry? And I did find out it came from Oswald Spengler, and this is what my chapter was about. It's called Kerouac's Felahin Poetics. It's a 2-volume book, as Kurt mentions. It's over 1,000 pages total. And Spengler set out, he said this is the first attempt to explain the life cycle of civilizations. And he says in the opening pages, civilizations are also like biological creatures. They have a birth, they grow up, they have an adulthood, and then they decline and they die. They decline in the West. And his idea was that the West, which so far was the most comprehensive civilization, so he named a few: the Egyptian civilization, the classical civilization, the Chinese civilization. And actually the word felahin, I was wondering why he used that. And apparently that's what the Arabs called the wandering Egyptians they found as they crossed North Africa. And so this turned up in some of Spengler's studies, felahin. He used that. Yes, as Kurt was saying, well, there are two kinds of peasants in Spengler. The peasants who start civilization, the ones who work the earth, she mentioned. Then they build towns and they build cities, towns and cities. And I think Kerouac was thinking in those terms. He was constantly thinking about Spengler. And yeah, and it was a very influential book. I mean, people read it everywhere in Europe and the United States. Sebastian Sampras introduced it to Kerouac first. Then Burroughs introduced it to Kerouac later on. Sebastian Sampras, in about 1941, 42, there's a beautiful letter he wrote to Jack. It's basically an expository account of some of Spengler's concepts, the idea of spatial expansion. So yeah, so the West is the civilization in Spengler's eyes that stretches throughout the world. And actually he predicted space travel in the 1920s. He said the West is doing this. The West is moving towards space travel. So Kerouac was fascinated with this idea. How do the pieces of the world fit together? But he didn't see the felahin, the people who were left over after the fall of an empire. And he was thinking in terms, you find references to this in his works, the French Empire in North America, the fall of the French Empire, when the French Empire falls to the British Empire at the end, during the French and Indian War. What's left? The French who are cut off, the French of Canada who are cut off from France, and I'll say more about this tomorrow, said to be an inferior race because they're cut off. This is a 19th century idea of race. Blood and soil was the 20th century version of this. You belong to a race and the race belongs to the land. Mind you, Spengler, yes, he was liked by the Nazis, but he didn't like the Nazis at all. In fact, he could not stand their anti-Semitism. So just to be clear on that, Spengler doesn't talk much about race. He talks in terms of nation. But yeah, but in the 19th century, they talked in terms of race. They said the French of Canada were an inferior race. This was said by the British. This was said in the United States also. But what Kerouac wanted to see the felahin as a really productive force, the force that was outside the world of governments, the world the outside the world of governance and diplomacy. And I have a quote from Desolation Angels about this that I'm going to read in a second. That's what I was looking for when I was scrambling through my phone during the introduction. And he. Yeah, so he wanted to see the felahin, the ones who were left over after the fall of an empire. And just as, you know, the felahin in Mexico, he says, the fall of the Aztec Empire, the fall of the Spanish Empire. Empires have fallen. What's left over? Felahin. And they're the ones who are standing outside civilization and making something entirely new. Contrary to Spengler. Mind you, other people have criticized Spengler who had nothing to do with Kerouac from the same perspective. So I'd like to read this. Am I going on too long?
No, yeah.
Okay, yeah, just, okay, yeah, so this quotation, I'm sorry, I have a bit of a cough and talking makes it worse. Okay, so, yeah, so this is from Desolation Angels. It's from late in the novel, from when Jacques Dudouos is in Morocco. And he says, why didn't the American consul ever walk into the urchin hall where Mohammed Melehy sat smoking, or squat behind empty buildings with old Arabs who talked with their hands, or anything? Instead, it's all private limousines, hotels, hotel restaurants, parties in the suburbs, and endless phony rejection in the name of democracy, of all that's pith and moment of every land. Pith and moment of every land. It's the people who stand outside this diplomacy. He puts democracy in quotation marks. I don't think he's criticizing the broader notion of democracy, but the narrower notion of democracy that we see. I mean, like when we were bringing democracy to Iraq, you remember, I mean, which we weren't, but we said we were, and that was a justification. I think that's the pith and moment of every land. He sees people as, who are standing outside these established institutions, which is how he saw himself, and wrestled with this like crazy because he goes to Columbia University. How much more inside established institutions can you be than to attend an Ivy League school, even if you don't graduate? Yeah, but that was where he saw his own writing as very important to represent and activate the energy of the fellaheen, to produce a new conception of the world. So I'll leave it at that.
So putting together this volume, it's in Thomas too. It's just an incredible collection, and it's no easy task to do this. And I was really honored to be a part of it, because I come at Kerouac so obliquely. A number of years ago now, when I was on a job interview here, they told me that Kerouac was from Lowell. I had zero idea if that was the case. Sort of embarrassingly. They were trying to hire me. They were hiring me as a 19th century cultural historian. So I didn't have much of a connection at all to Kerouac. I had read On the Road, when I was about 14 or 15 years old. I'd loved Ginsberg deeply as a teenager, but I hadn't thought much about either since going off to college and graduate school and so forth. But I'm an archive person. I've spent a lot of time in archives of the late 18th and first half of the 19th century, Americanist archives mainly. And eventually I encountered John Sampas, and John was as many people know, was the person who essentially ran the Kerouac estate for many years. And for various different reasons, I got to know John, and I ended up sitting around his house a lot, and just talking to him about Kerouac, and seeing what he was trying to do with Kerouac. And at John's house, you were literally surrounded by the archive. You would sit at this round modern table in his living room, and there were file cabinets all around you, and there were file cabinets upstairs that John would sometimes run up, get stuff out of, and he would just start pulling things out and showing it to you. And I actually got into Kerouac through John, because I got interested in what he was doing with archives, and the way that he thought about archives, which I thought was just so amazing. A lot of people had some troubles with John, but he was thinking about Kerouac's archive in really interesting, novel ways. And I have to say, the humanities are not exactly a growth industry. And I was sort of wondering whether or not I was going to stick around and here that long, because I just wasn't sure that there was a whole lot of future to this. And the future that I saw in Lowell was around Kerouac and what John was trying to do with him. He was trying to do all sorts of things with him, and he had a number of ideas that never came to fruition, I think, but a lot of ideas that do come to fruition. And I don't think that we would be sitting here today without John's work. In 2022 at the Centennial, I wrote a piece about John, sort of an homage to John, and it gave me some time to think about archives, and all the different things that you could do with archives. And so this opportunity to write again about Kerouac's archive came up, and so I just used it as an opportunity to think about two things. And the first was, why do we have this kind of insular notion of the archive as a place that is primarily inhabited by scholars? And the second thing it gave me an opportunity to think about was, what might we do with Kerouac's archive in other archives? And to tell you the truth, I've long been interested in the way artists have used archives. So I took the opportunity to think through the idea that what would happen if we opened up the Kerouac archive more and more to its use by artists. So I'll just in my remarks there, but with the suggestion that if you have ideas about how you would like to artistically use the Kerouac archive, I would certainly be interested in hearing them.
Thanks to all of our panelists here. So, I mean, this is Talking Jack, so let's talk some Jack. So, do we have questions or comments, or I'd like to, I'm assuming there's going to be some audience interest and kind of inquiries, so I'd like to open it up.
I got two questions. I'm curious about what the context was of Everybody Goes Home in October on the road. And is John and Jack the same person that you were just speaking about?
John?
You mentioned like John, just from the comments that you were just saying.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was talking about John Samples,
Oh,
who was the
we're talking about
person
John
who ran the Kerouac estate from the 1990s until
He was
his
the
death.
younger brother of Sebastian Samples, who was Kerouac's best friend, one of his best friends in high school, and they stayed in touch in college. He died in the Second World War, and just to fill it in, Stella Kerouac, their sister, was his third wife.
So the Everybody Goes Home in October must have some context. Or maybe it's unknowable right now.
No,
He says it. I'm sorry, I don't have that.
It's,
Steve, that's become the, I hate to use the word slogan, it's become the watch phrase for Lowell Celebrates Kerouac. We put that everywhere, everybody goes home in October. And I'm sure, like everybody here knows, it's an on the road as his relationship with the woman he calls Terry, who's a Mexican farm laborer. The real name is Lee Franco. She passed away a few years ago. And their relationship is beginning to wind down as Kerouac sees it. And they kind of make these vague plans that he's going to go to New York and then she's going to come and meet him in New York. But they both know that that's never going to happen. So as Kerouac is getting ready to leave her, and he says it was October, and everybody goes home in October, then the next line is, well, lack-a-day, I was on the road again, and off he goes. The home he's going to actually is in New York, where his mother is living at that time. But you can read different layers of that. That's one of the reasons we have this festival in October, is because of that passage. And Jack went to his eternal home on the 21st of October in 1969. So thanks for letting me jump in there.
Oh, okay, thanks for the clarification. I've just always been curious.
I would add to that, Kerouac, if you read some of the published and unpublished journals, you'll see he has a thing for numerology and patterns. He seems to think every 7 years something big happens to him. Something big happens to him on the decades, 40s, 50s, 60s. In fact, I think his January 1960 notebook says something like, "This is gonna be my best decade ever." Of course, we know how it ended. And he would also, he's also really in touch with when he thought he produced his best writing, which was in October, and if I remember correctly from a couple journal entries, September, October, and then like March, April, he also felt he was kind of filled with the power of the muses, right? So perhaps there's some extension with that idea of everyone going home in October, because he was in touch with that idea of that was his creative force would come home to him too.
And it gets cold.
It's cold?
It gets cold. You don't want to be on the road in November and December.
Right,
You want to go home when there's a fireplace.
October comes up
North
quite a
Carolina.
bit. I mean, in his work, October the Railroad, or
Yeah.
I think it's kind of great. To me, it always spoke to a bit of a melancholy streak running through it. October's great. I mean, as a Californian, winter is kind of, I'm not loving it. October, you get that as nice, like a beautiful day. It's beautiful and sunny, you get the leaves, but at the same time, there's that hint of coldness, and it's coming. And I think that's how I always read that.
Kerouac disliked the summer, I think. I think that's right. I remember that from someplace.
Yeah, in October and then the spring would make these sort of turning points, right? Pivot points.
Yeah, he mentions that in Desolation. It's football.
Football, yeah. Yeah, the back to school and right.
Yeah, it's supposed, I believe it's parents were married in October, and his sister might have been born in the month of October also. So there's a lot of
I just wanted to add about football. It made me think of something. The wonderful football game description in which is a description of the 1938. It is 1938. Yes, it's the 1938, the fall of 1938 Lowell Lawrence game, where Kerouac scores the upset touchdown, and then he gets recruited by colleges after that. But he writes a fictionalized version of that in The Town and the City with Peter Martin as the protagonist, and he says, I can't remember where I read this, it's been a while, but he based that scene on the shot breakdown of the last scene in Marcel Carné's Children of Paradise, the occupation era, the great occupation era film that came out just at the end of the French occupation, the German occupation of France. And incidentally, just to say, yes, he loved cinema. He was an aficionado. He knew movies very deeply, and probably his favorite current in cinema was French poetic realism. Marcel Carné and Julien Duvivier, especially. His favorite actor was Jean Gabin, and he mentions a Duvivier film in Dr. Sachs, the Saint Teresa film, which I actually only saw very recently because Duvivier's, now you can get all the early works, the early silent works. But also then there was a novel, I'm forgetting his name now. He was actually French, but he moved to Quebec and tried to become, he was from a French literary family, and he wrote a novel called Maria Châtelaine. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the novelist's name. It was a huge publication. It was published simultaneously in English and French in Paris, New York, and Montreal. Maria Châtelaine, and the film version was made by Julien Duvivier, shot in Quebec in 6 months, partly in the winter. And one of the characters, played by Jean-Pierre Aubon, one of the great stars of French cinema, actually makes a trip to Lowell. The protagonist is named François Paradis, played by Jean Gabin, Kerouac's favorite actor. Joyce Johnson was the one to point to me that François Paradis from the novel is likely at least a partial model for Sal Paradise. And the fact that he was actually played, which Joyce didn't, which I pointed out to Joyce, was played by Kerouac's favorite actor, actually kind of clinched that, made that speculation all the more probable. But just to say a little bit more about movies, yeah, but French poetic realism especially, the films of the 30s, Carné, and Duvivier especially, but yeah.
And Kerouac is in one of Andy Warhol's films.
Yes.
Yeah, which is, I don't know, worth seeing. He acts out a little baseball scene, and he goes to the toilet and brings back a commode.
Yeah.
It's all silent, but he is speaking and reciting things. Ginsberg is there too, and I think, if I remember correctly, Gregory Corso. Yeah.
The movie's called Couch, and
So-
it's the opening scene is, and there's a fourth unidentified person.
Yeah.
So you can't. I don't think you can see it. It's.
Yeah,
I
you-
had to because while I was
Yeah.
working on my biography of Corso, I contacted the Andy Warhol Museum, and
Yeah.
they sent me a copy.
Yeah.
And it's one of those films they don't show very much. They're the opening scene, and it's Kerouac and Ginsberg and Orlovsky and Corso and someone else that they could not identify, and they're on a couch. And what happens throughout the film is there's these other vignettes on the couch, including full-on sex, and that's why it'd be too scandalous today to like show it like in a cinema. The only part of it
We showed it
that's-
here in Lowell.
Did you?
Yeah.
I'm surprised.
So there's another
I'm
version,
surprised because you'll see guys giving each other blowjobs.
Yeah, there's a reel that.
So.
Well, it's as with everything with Warhol, it's a complicated production history. But there is a reel that's not included in Couch that's mainly of Kerouac, and that's, I think, if I remember correctly, that's where he acts out the baseball game. Because he doesn't do it in the first reel. From
Is
Couch.
any of this part of Pull My Daisy?
No,
Is this-
it's completely different.
Yeah. This is
Completely
made in
different. But
64.
people have commented on it as being an homage to Paul Daisy, right? That
I know
he
there's a
starts
big
off
couch- there's a
with
couch
these
scene on
characters
that.
from
Yeah.
Paul
Yeah,
Daisy.
later on.
I think it's definitely Andy, you know, thinking back to Pull My Days.
So is it, I'm looking at it real quick. It's 54 minutes with or without the missing reel?
There are lots of missing reels.
Okay.
So,
That's-
you know,
okay, so it's
this is
Warhol.
this is one of Warhol's projects that went on for a while. I don't know how many reels Kerouac appears on.
Just one in the.
Just one in Couch.
Okay.
Yeah,
And it's
which
not the
is,
BJ
as you
thing.
said, a collection of different reels. Of,
Yeah, so basically, I
Various
mean,
different
like
people.
Warhol would do, he'd run like a 2-minute.
Yeah.
He'd just run it out.
Yeah.
So it's like, all
Yeah.
right, 2 minutes, and then another 2 minutes,
Yeah.
and then another 2 minutes of different people interacting.
These were made on 100-foot Bolex
Okay.
reels. Yeah,
Gotcha. Thank you.
yeah. So they're three minutes long. Andy would show them at a slower pace. They went out for about 4
And
minutes.
would they always play in the same order, or would he mix them up and play them in different orders?
As far as I
Probably.
know, there's one order.
Okay. No order.
What about, what year was this?
1964. Ginsberg's living in the village then, and Ginsberg in the East Village, and Ginsberg becomes friends with, you know, the factory crew.
Is this before or after the meeting with Leary and
This is-
Cassidy was there and
Yeah.
Kerouac went raped himself in America?
Couch is probably made.
Oh, you
Couch is
mean
made a
Kesey.
little bit before that.
You mean,
yeah.
you mean Ken Kesey?
Yeah, Couch is made a little bit before that. Roughly the same time though.
You notice that Hassan and I pronounced the name of Kerouac's persona differently. Because I've been coming to this since the early 90s. And I was here the last time Allen Ginsberg was here. And when Allen Ginsberg was here, someone asked him, how do you pronounce the name? Because we don't have Kerouac say it.
I
Anywhere.
actually heard an obscure, I don't know where I got it on the internet, I don't know if I saved it, but he actually says, and I can't, for the life of
I've
me
never-
remember how he says it. And he
Please
says,
tell me, 'cause
"It's
I've
due
never
to
heard
us,
it."
You assholes.
And Ginsberg said that more often than not, the names have the same rhythm as the real names. Gregory Corso, Raphael Urso.
Sure.
And so he says it was Kerouac, Duluaz.
Yes.
Not Toulouse, not with a French accent, Duluaz. And that's how Ginsberg told me, that's what I'm gonna go with.
Okay, Duluaz, I'll keep that in mind, thanks.
Sound totally convinced. There's a question in the back.
Yeah, well, I was going to mention to Brett that one place to look, if you haven't, is the notebook that has the scripture of the Golden Eternity and Wish and Midnight in it, because it's got that whole thing about, it's kind of allegorical movie about North Atlantis, and, you know, he calls himself the River Heart. Yeah, it's pretty interesting.
Okay. Thanks for that, Charles. I haven't seen that.
Oh, yeah, so that notebook, you know, which is in the Bird. One other thing, you know, when I read all this stuff and then like after the fact, suddenly something will really resonate. So I can't remember, but there is the manuscript where Pick and Slim go to New York and they meet up with young Jack and Neil, and they're playing in sort of like it's like a Chinatown gambling parlor crash pad, and then they go to a couple of women that are like Vicky Russell is in a bath. And do you know what manuscript that is?
Is that old Bull in the Bower?
Is it? Okay, I gotta double check. I gotta go back. Yeah, that one sticks with me.
Yeah.
It's really interesting, and it parallels also what was going on in The Legend of Three Houses, which is in the Buddhist years, where again it's young Jack and young Neil, and when the moment they get to Chinatown in that one, it just ends. But it's very psychological.
Yeah. Awesome. Thanks for that, Charles.
Brett, you mentioned he was into numerology.
Yeah. They seem to be, yeah.
Well, so I'm going to use that as an opportunity to ask a little tangential question, but does anybody know if he read any alchemy? Because in Dr. Sachs, he's the dark alchemist, right? Who's fighting the world snake, which I think could be interpreted as the Ouroboros, which runs all throughout alchemy. And it seems like in his reading, the way he uses color, you know, color is very important in alchemy, and the transformations of black into red and all these things. And, you know, he projected into it relating to like transformations of consciousness. I've never run across anything that said he, you know, read that, but I was curious if any.
Well, it's subtitled Faust Part 3.
Well, he read Goethe. He read Dichtung und Truth, Poetry and Truth. The English title is usually Dichtung und Wahrheit also. And he did read Christopher Marlowe's. Somebody, not me, demonstrated that Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus is also one of the sources of Dr. Sachs. And yeah, and I mean, Goethe was really interested in color, for one thing. I can't speak more specifically than that, but that may well be a source of his interest in color. I mean, Christopher Marlowe is loaded with really sinister, dark, and alchemical kinds of stuff. So he did read a fair amount of Renaissance literature, actually. So yes, I think he could easily come across alchemical references in all kinds of books he read. Yeah.
Well, the ending seems he throws the herbs in that pit, right? There.
Yeah.
Now that you say that, it resonates. I haven't read it in a while, but memories that I can see where you're going with that.
Yeah.
Which is failure, right? In the end, he doesn't stop it, right? And so
But the universe takes care of itself.
the universe takes care of itself, right? So he's ineffectual, but he is this alchemist.
But I mean, isn't the twist, correct me if I'm wrong, on Faust, that Faust is damned in both Goethe and Marlowe, whereas Sachs is like, he's like an ineffectual Faust, but the power outside of him actually does the job, and it's a redeeming thing. It's not a damnation for selling your soul to the devil. And you have to question, like, is Jackie supposed to be the one that's making the deal with? Is Sachs making a deal with, you know, or who's making the deal in
Take that on.
Well, his explanation was, let me see. His explanation was that he was interested in the part about technology getting out of control, and that's where Faust makes the bargain with the devil. He enables himself with, and because he mentions H-bombs, and then he also he works through Spengler, because Spengler's biggest, he says, the most important European philosopher was Goethe. You know, he says Nietzsche was pretty good but limited. Goethe was the man. You know. And in Faust, that's what happens. I mean, at the end, there's technological progress. This peasant family gets killed because of technological progress. And Spengler takes that, he talks about space exploration, and Kerouac talks about the H-bomb. And he talks about it, and he says H, and meaning not just the hydrogen bomb, but the heroin bomb, meaning the hydrogen bomb is as addictive as heroin. And I think that's where he sees the, if you want to call it evil, or at least the danger of technology coming to the point of being able to destroy the world. And I think I don't know. I mean, I've read it, and I've tried reading Faust twice, Goethe's Faust twice, and Dr. Sachs twice at the same time, and trying to figure out what. And I don't, you know, somebody else might. I could just have a blind spot here. I don't see that kind of mapping here.
No, there isn't. I mean, it's sort of fanciful notion.
Yeah, but he does say, I think in two different places, he's interested in technology and space missiles and the H-bomb. When he's asked, well, why do you call this Faust Part 3? It's in a letter to Brigitte Lane, and I think I've seen it in two different places. So,
Yeah, I think you're right. Jackie's relationship is kind of interesting because he's looking to him, you know, Sachs, as he's kind of coming into his own understanding of the world, right? So I think there's that element of it too, right? And so it's Faust, you know, what does knowledge bring, right? What is knowledge? On the one hand, it's you know, he's interested, right? I mean, Faust is compelling, Faust, Sachs, whatever, is a compelling figure in the novel, but sort of ineffectual. I mean, you know, so that's the shadowy nature of him, right? I mean, and I think that's, I don't think it's so much Jackie's pack, but it's Jackie's fascination, which is sort of I read it sort of symbolic of his kind of, he's what, 13 or something? He's kind of coming into adulthood, right? Sexual all these sort of awakenings, and it's like Faust / Sax, right, sort of represents that entry into adult knowledge. That's how I see
Yeah,
it.
it's also like the innocence of the, like puberty is like the end of innocence.
Right,
there's,
right.
There's all this psychosexual shit going on anyway.
But there's also the stuff about world migration and the Fellaheen.
Right,
And,
right.
Yeah.
But he's also interested in Goethe there, and I noticed this, and I did point this out in my book. Again, it's one of those speculative things, but when my wife, who was from Germany, when we were visiting the Goethe house in Frankfurt, the opening passage when Goethe himself, it's an intellectual autobiography, talks about his own birth. She points out that it looks as though Kerouac was riffed on that to write the story of his own birth in Dr. Sachs. She said it's exactly like a beautiful passage in Dr. Sachs. And I did it because, but Goethe does it in terms of the stars, and Kerouac does it in terms of earthly movement, the movement of the Merrimack and so forth. You know, curiously enough, and it's almost like he's moving Goethe's astrology down to earth. I don't know. This is where I see the relationship, because it's Faust Part 3, but it's also a lot of exploration of Goethe and Spengler. So.
Part of what I do in my chapter to complicate how Kerouac sees himself is that he refers to his mother as Fellaheen. So he thinks of himself as Fellaheen too, which I think complicates his notion of whiteness. And I think he doesn't think of himself as white.
No.
And if you'll notice in On the Road, whenever he talks about, you know, his white ambitions, he puts them in quotation marks. And he purposely makes himself the type of person that can pass as not being white. Remember, he's a Mexican, right? When the Okies come to attack the Mexicans, because we Mexicans, he says.
In a way, I am. In a way, I am. Curiously enough.
Right, and so he has this and I think that's one of the most interesting things that I think a lot of people have not. I think it's rich with there's much more that needs to be done with that conception of how he thinks of whiteness, right? Which I think is way more complex than I think other white writers of his generation.
Well, you know, isn't it indigenous is what we call it now, or aborigine, or like the people who are so connected to the land that the mechanization of everything really doesn't, you know, affect them. But the other thing about being white, I mean, for one thing, like he gets to go to Columbia. Like, you know, I mean, that would be a vindication of anybody who felt disenfranchised and dispossessed of a lower class, you know, indigenous people. But because of what happens to him there, and because of his struggles in publishing, I think it exacerbated that sense of being disenfranchised, like from the get-go. I mean, I had that same feeling, you know, growing up Italian, American. It's like, really did, you know, it wasn't like whiteness, you know, on paper, but really, you know, like in 1923, they had an Immigration Restriction Act, limiting, like classifying Southern Italians as non-white and not preferred, not wanted, as opposed to Northern Italians. So, I mean, there's always that north-south, that like, am I really enfranchised?
Well, and he gets into Columbia for his football ability.
Yeah, exactly.
Ironically, it's like they want him because he can play the sport and they can win games for him. So there's also that level.
It's like the side door, you know, like going to the back door of a restaurant.
Well, the brawn, you know, it's like the hardworking president.
Yeah,
he was an educated man. Don't discredit his getting into.
No,
I'm not doing that.
I was saying.
As they've been elucidating, though, he had bigger things on his mind about what world civilization and all that. That the fanciful notion of his writing sort of makes you think he wasn't But he was a smart puppy. He knew a lot about
Well, they
stuff.
made him go to Horace Mann for a year. They paid for that. And ironically, because he didn't have enough French credits, he went to French parochial school, 4 hours in French a day, 4 hours in English, until he was 11. So he didn't take French in high school. He didn't have the French credits. So, but he actually made money writing term papers for these limousine kids who didn't want to write them themselves or couldn't write them themselves. You know, it's
Well, that's it. Like you were talking about your education in French and that what you were learning in high school, what didn't match up with. Well, you just mentioned that in the first four years of his primary school, what French were they?
Well, that's the thing. Okay, because there was spoken French in town. Okay, but what they were teaching in the parochial schools was grammatically correct French. It was accented differently. One of the most pronounced differences, the first one I noticed when I was a kid, in French you have Paris, the uvular R. Paris, yeah. À Paris, on va faire plus de choses, je sais pas. And then you have in Quebec, it's the lingual, it's the rolled R, it's the trilled R, it's the Paris, or Montréal. And that's one difference. So it was accented differently, but they did. It was the clerics who were teaching them, and they taught as correct a French as possible. I mean, like to write in completely correct sentences, which Kerouac could do. He was actually, I believe he was the typist for a French textbook written by Eugene Scheffer, who was the founder of the Maison Française at Columbia. French professor, and also was the first New York Times crossword puzzle creator. But he could do completely correct French, but he wanted to reproduce the oral French. But yes, there's a spoken French, and there was that level. Roger Brunel was really good on this because he said he learned 3 different Frenches. He learned the French of Lowell. And he went to the same parochial school when they were still teaching 4 hours a day in French and 4 hours a day in English. And then he went to seminary in Quebec and learned that French, which was the more recent version of Canadian French. And then he got, when he had his first sabbatical, he did the Middlebury Masters in Paris, and so he learned Parisian French. That's what he told me the first time we talked about his French, 3 different Frenches, and we talked about Jack's different languages, different Englishes, and different Frenches.
So like Dan was saying, a testament to his intelligence was what you talked about using 16th century words when that's like a mental pun that he's playing with and playing on the reader, because I know how to do this correctly, but I'm going to throw these.
Well, there are some archaisms in Quebecois French. Like there's one in the word astur, which I know because I'm a French Renaissance specialist, and it means à cette heure now. Astur, but it's spelled in 16th century. They just spell it actually phonetically, A-S-T-U-R-E, as opposed to à cette heure, 3 words. And it's actually still used in Quebec. It's not used in France. Kerouac would use that one, but then he would throw in a few others that are not actually used, archaisms that he knew, to sort of gin up that idea of it being a pre-revolutionary French. And mind you, I looked this up finally. That idea of Quebecois French as 16th, 17th century French only dates the beginning of the 20th century. They didn't think of it that way before. Yeah, this is like it was sort of an apology for speaking the wrong French. You know, when people started accusing your French is wrong. No, it's 16th century French. Yeah.
If I can say, like, I'm from Quebec, so French, but when I read Hommage de Vidamage, I had to read it out loud, because I couldn't, because the joie was a lot of old Quebec, like you say, but also like Lowell, you know, and so it's all mixed, and I had to read it out loud, because it was so hard to read, you know? But so it was very interesting to have that, like you say, it's, very different mix of French.
built-in power. Bricks
And a style,
And incidentally, just last year,
Gallimard, which is France's most prestigious publishing company, which published Kerouac from the beginning. They considered him one of the greatest American writers. They published Sur le Chemin. They published it as a standalone book. And Jean-Christophe Cloutier, he promised me he's going to be here tomorrow. He told his editor there, he said, you know, this is kind of first circle. This is the first original Kerouac you're publishing. And he said she didn't quite get what he was saying. This is the first Kerouac in original French you're publishing as opposed to a translation. But yeah, it's full circle. It was just last year. Yes.
Oh, I'm sorry to keep asking questions here. I know that there was the Jack played hooky from Lowell High School, and he was reading books that he wanted to read. Maybe speculative, I'm not sure, but did he find himself reading books that the teachers would have assigned him to read when he was going to Lowell High School, or was he like reading books that I know he was reading books that he wanted to read, but did any of the books end up having to be required reading for like he was in class for like English or at the high school, or I'm just kind of throwing that out there.
Anybody know?
I think the Lowell people.
Yeah, that's Marvel. There's actually, I think, Bill, you've got the tour coming up, and was it Sunday? You kind of Saturday, yeah. You kind of covered that a little bit, right? Yeah, the library hooky tour.
Yeah, the library.
That's exactly specifically what it's about. Is your exact question is the entire tour about it.
He would have been necessarily at Lowell High School.
So he was reading books that wouldn't have been read at Lowell.
Yeah, but he also would go, he would actually take days off, and his teachers knew what he was doing, so he got away with it. He would go to the library and read all day long. And he read, they bought it in the late 19th century, the complete translated works of Goethe. He read the entirety of it. That's when he first read, so among other things, He read, but he would read in the library, and he read whatever he could get his hands on. He loved literature. So,
when I was a graduate student, I decided that I was going to study Jack Kerouac because I believed he was the most American writer. And now Hassan has fucked that up for me. And I think you'll see the trend now in academia is which is great. People like Hassan and Jean-Christophe Cloutier are now revealing how much he wrote in French, how much his French identity played a massive role in his being. And I think we're learning things now that when I started 30 years ago learning about Kerouac, this was not talked about. And I think it's very exciting, the work that they're doing.
I do think of him as an American novelist, though, too. But I think he did see America as a crossroads of migration, and that was, and so I think even his interest in European. I'm pretty sure that there were a lot of French language movies showing in Lowell in the 30s. They did show the Saint Teresa film in his high school. He says so in Dr. Sachs' DVD. So I think that his experience is as a Franco-American, and that's how I see it. And I think that's what he wanted to emphasize. And I think, but he did think in terms of world literature, but American literature. He did see something really important in America and did think of himself as an American, but an American who did think of just to repeat, America as a kind of a global crossroads, and that's the way I see him. So
maybe I can wrap things up a bit by posing a question to Michael, because I think this is, you're very quiet. I noticed that last night too. Started getting you to speak and you didn't want to speak, putting you on the spot. This discussion of the archive, I think, is fascinating. It reminds me, I was in Germany. People think differently of archives. I was in Germany, you have to fight your way into the archive, and they're rarely not very happy that you're there. I mean, the archive is a repository of precious documents that you're not supposed to really be around, but they have to let you in. And I found that firsthand. It was kind of strange, but obviously the idea of an engaged archive is what you're talking about. As you write not, you know, extensively in your chapter about that, right? How the archive, how you bring the archive out, how you bring Kerouac out of the archive to engage like a larger public. And I was wondering if you could talk more about that, or if you see that as the future of getting people to kind of think about Kerouac and bring him, you know, wider attention. And then maybe even how to negotiate as archivist this split, right? And in one way, he has a lot of French-Canadian, French materials, but on the other hand, people are also enamored with his American road persona, right? How does one deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, so we have archives of all sorts of contemporary 20th century writers that we don't do much with. I mean, it may be not as restrictive here as in Germany, I don't know. And so, you know, I've been very interested in turning our archive into museum exhibits, films, and I'm just, you know, I want it to be a participatory archive, right? I want it to be something that we can infuse through the city in various ways, and I want archivists to think of themselves as, well, I want some part of archivists to think of themselves as sort of in the way gallerists, you know, in the 20th century thought of their relationship to the visual arts. And I don't know exactly what that looks like. I mean, it's so incredibly rare that sort of thing happens with an archive, and I think there's some difficulties with it, and part of it has to do with the way that we, you know, structured what's valued in by you know, academic institutions, and what's valued in the kind of interpretive work that academics do. So I'm really interested in hearing ideas from, you know, artists, filmmakers, the general public who don't necessarily think of themselves as artists, you know, as culture makers, about what to do with the archive, right? So I really think that it would be interesting if we thought about our archives as participatory rather than places that are, you know, silent and cordoned off a little bit.